We're doing top 5 Bitcoin mining stories in all time history. So if you are an enjoyer of the Bitcoin mining mines, then you might know these stories already. I'm sorry, but it's going to be a good recap for you. And then you can kind of hear the debate at the end. I think Matt and Colin will have their own ideas. And then if you are new to Bitcoin mining, these are stories you should definitely know just in terms of the lore. So as always, I'm going to rip through these 5 little ideas here. And then at the end, you guys can give me your peanut gallery takes. And if you're an enjoyer of the podcast and you don't like my choices, then feel free to chirp at me. I got a lot of chirps last week with the Vibe rankings of the Bitcoin miners. And we will continue to Vibe rank them every month. So stay tuned. For the first one, as you can see on the screen, Riot buys the Rockdale site. So the history here is that there was actually a former builder of this data center, the Windstone Group. They built this out. They purchased it, I believe, around 2019, and they got it going. Riot came in 2021 and completed the purchase of Rockdale. Why is this on my list? Well, I think it's really simple. I think this is one of those stories that shows how Bitcoin mining professionalized to a huge data center size, where we have one of, if not the largest data centers in the world being used for Bitcoin mining. This also brought around the conversation of using Bitcoin mining for demand response on the Texas grid. And then lastly, there's been a huge ESG and then green energy debate focused around this data center. A lot of that was also in New York in 2021, 2022. But I think like this data campus, the size, the scope of it has been the centerpiece of many stories in mainstream media, particularly some pieces in the New York Times. So for that reason, I give it number 5 spot on my Bitcoin mining history list. Let's go over to 4. Laszlo, famous for buying pizza with Bitcoin. Obviously a very important story, but another story people don't know about is he is probably, if not for sure, the first GPU miner on the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin mining
he for sure was.
For sure was. You heard it here first on the show. We started with CPU mining, and then we went to GPU mining, and then we went to FPGAs for a short window, and then traditional ASICs, which will also be on this list in a second. But Laszlo bringing in GPU mining was a game changer. We will get into that more in a second. Number 3 on my list, the Avalon One debut. So we have this nice photo here from our friends over at the Bitcoin Mining Museum. The Avalon One was the first shipped ASIC in the market. And this sort of started changing the entire game for Bitcoin mining to industrial scale developments and not just, parents' basement. I'm mining Bitcoin on CPUs and GPUs. That still, surprisingly, a lot of people think it is today. This brought about the industrial scaling of Bitcoin mining. 4 on my list, Jihan Wu, Bitmain, and I'd say like the Bitcoin corporations at the time trying to take over Bitcoin with the SegWit 2x hard fork and then the BCH hard fork as well. You can see in the screens where the timeline here, and this seems to be coming from whatever source I chose for it. It seems to be like a pro BCH propaganda, and they're showing like BCH going up in price over a short window. But the main point here is just to look at the timeline and see what happened with BCH, a very mining centric hard fork. And just to like kind of put it in context of history, I think a lot of the history gets lost here, and how it's sort of remembered now is that it was like miners versus developers and plebs. I think that's reductive, but I do think that it's close enough to the truth where we can include it in our top 5. Now, number 1, I don't think is surprising to anyone, and that's going to be the China Bitcoin mining ban of 2021. Colin and I were both working at mining companies at the time this happened, and it was nuts. 50% of the network's hash rate went off in the course of a few days, and Bitcoin miners started fleeing China, moving to different jurisdictions, the US, Kazakhstan, South America, other places. And I think the reverberations from this Bitcoin mining ban are still being felt today. Today, there's about 20% of the network hash rate still operating in China, and there's obviously a lot of the most important players in the Bitcoin mining manufacturing space are based in China. Okay, those are my top 5. I'm going to open it up to the peanut gallery. I'll throw it to you first, Colin, to talk about Laszlo.
I honestly would put Laszlo at number one in terms of early Bitcoin history for the importance. I mean, I think objectively, probably the China ban is the most significant out of all of these events in terms of how it's just completely reshaped the entire industry. But what Laszlo essentially did when he introduced GPU mining in May 2010, which was shortly after he released the first Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core, he kind of introduced professional Bitcoin mining, right? Before, it was a bunch of hobbyists on their computers, and maybe some of them had a bunch of computers going on at once. But once Laszlo introduced GPU mining, you had this transition to guys setting up multiple GPUs in their homes, in their basements, in their bonus rooms, etc., to farm Bitcoin, right? And before the Bitcoin mining industry, it wasn't even an industry at that time, right? But the nascent Bitcoin mining landscape was much more of a hobbyist thing. And this, with GPU mining, transitioned us into a more professional sphere for it. And those GPU mining farms were kind of like the proto Bitcoin mining farms that are massive mega data centers that we see today, right? And a few other things about Laszlo that people don't know outside of the fact that he introduced the first Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core and also GPU mining. Most people know him, as you said, Will, for the infamous Bitcoin pizza purchase back in 2010, where he spent like 10K Bitcoin on two Papa John's pizzas. He facilitated the transaction with another Bitcoiner on Bitcoin Talk. But he said something to me in an interview with Bitcoin Magazine back in the day that really stood out to me. Really, he said three things. Number one, he ended up actually spending something near 100,000 Bitcoin on pizza that year. So he didn't just spend the 10,000 Bitcoin that's worth a crap ton today, right? He ended up also spending 10 times that. And part of the reason that he did that was, he said, and I quote, "I felt like I crapped on Satoshi's project because Satoshi had been talking to him on Bitcoin Talk saying, hey, I didn't think people were going to figure out GPU mining for a long time. And I'm a little worried about concentration of coins into few hands for the people who spin these things up." So Laszlo's pizza purchases were almost like a financial sacrifice to appease his guilty conscience for rolling this out. The last thing he said that really stood out to me was he doesn't really look back on the pizza purchase with regret. And if you see some of these interviews he's done with mainstream media, like, he's got a really nice house in Florida. He's got a great family. Dude's doing fine. Those probably weren't his only Bitcoins. But he said, I wanted to do the pizza thing because to me it was free pizza. I mean, I coded this thing and mined Bitcoin and I felt like I was winning the internet that day. I got pizza for contributing to an open source project. Usually hobbies are a time sink and money sink. And in this case, my hobby bought me dinner. So despite the sensationalizing, Laszlo has pretty good humor about it. And I do think that the GPU mining that he introduced and his contributions there get overshadowed by the pizza thing. And it was really one of the most significant developments in the history of Bitcoin mining in terms of what it did to transition us to more organized mining farms.
All right, well, I think you did a decent job, I will say. I think you did pretty good.
Better than last week with the Vibe rankings?
There's got to be some honorable mentions here, though. That's my take. Also,
True.
One last Laszlo tidbit, although he's dominating the show at this point, is that he was a core maintainer at one point. I mean, he is a prominent figure in Bitcoin history. Yeah, an equipment-heavy top 5, first ASIC, first GPU. I get it.
True.
Big deal. I get it.
Yep.
I think that the block size wars I get that one. I think it's a little high on my list because it's more of I think, Bitcoin governance top 5 in history. Although it kind of unveiled the game theory about miners, where they would choose on a chain split, right? And have that an actual practical example. But that was, I think, much bigger and messier than just mining itself. But mining is such a rich history. Like, no mention of mining pools here. Zero. There's, the big news at the time was, ghash.io getting, near 50% of block production, questions of miner centralization. Before that, even the lesser discussed BTC Guild, I believe. You could have gone with, I think Brains had the first pool. That's a pretty big and lasting impact on the mining ecosystem. another that I think we will kind of look back on as ushering in maybe kind of like a glimpse into the future of Bitcoin mining. So a tidbit we would add maybe a couple years from now is the first block where transaction fees outpaced the subsidy, right? And I think that may have happened like on accident a couple times in Bitcoin history, but the like most notable to me was around the halving, this last halving, 2024, right? With the 4 megabyte blocks block was another one. But there, yeah, I think you missed a couple here. I'll be honest with you. I think that you got to come back to the drawing board and maybe.
What would you take out? What would you take out of my top 5?
I think that you're
hesitancy. You
Riot a lot. I think you're giving Riot.
Giving Riot a lot. Okay, so one.
Like you can. Okay, you could have talked.
Would you take Laszlo out?
Era of very interesting like mining seasonality in China. Your U.S. bias is coming out right now.
I mean, I put the China ban as the top. I mean, okay, I think the pool stuff is interesting. I will give you that. I think the ordinals block, that was my top 6 ordinals. But to defend my Riot pick, that brought about a huge conversation. It was the beginning of the modern industrial Bitcoin mining industry, with all the touch points from the White House to the farm country of the United States. So I think that was a great pick.
I'm not to dogpile on the CEO of Blockspace here, but I feel like the Whinstone thing was more of a reflection in the public markets of something that had been going on for a long time in the private markets. I mean, to be sure, Whinstone ended up becoming the largest farm of it
and data center in the world,
in the US. But you know, I do think it's one of those things where I could see why you would put it in there, but maybe putting pools in its place, and maybe we do just axe the Bitcoin Cash hard fork. It definitely was, though. The hash wars are a big thing too. I would agree, because like,
I mean, think about it. That basically set, from a governance perspective, put miners in their place in a lot of ways, right? Where like they don't have a seat at the table, and you know, for us, we want them to have a seat at the table, so we're always advocating for that again. But like, they really haven't been a part of Bitcoin governance in almost a decade now. For a currency that they live off of.
It definitely did. Sorry, one thing I'll say, Matt, then I want you to jump in. It is the perfect confluence of all of the governance aspects of Bitcoin. It was the node operators, it was the miners, and it was the market choosing Bitcoin over anything else. So it does deserve a seat at the table, in the sense that the big miners backed by Jihan ended up losing, and it was a powerful testament to the incentives that underpin the entire system. But anyway, sorry, Matt.
No, it's good. That's a good tidbit. It was interesting too. I remember at the time there being op returns in Coinbase transactions that were kind of like, you know, advocating for just adding commentary. Like, I remember specifically seeing like a "Make Bitcoin Great Again" op return at the time of like a very contentious moment in Bitcoin history. I will push back against Will's comment that they are not a part of Bitcoin governance in the last 10 years, because miners still have to flag for activation. They were a part of the Taproot upgrade. They're a significant stakeholder in the Bitcoin protocol development. That being said, I think that it did shift a lot of the way we think about how Bitcoin's protocol rules progress, right? And what really the kind of separation of powers, the checks and balances, if you will, are between the stakeholders.
We're going to leave it there for this week's tier list. We'll come back with another one next week.
All right, gentlemen, separate.
Yeah.